Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. As you can see, we kind of moved things around just a little bit because I thought that my setup needed a little bit of a change just to make it easier for me to kind of film and get things underway. So I'm now in this corner of the room here as opposed to being in front of my desks, which are now behind you, where my phone and my tripod are now sitting on. I've got my piano here in the corner because I think it's a nice little aesthetically pleasing thing, right? I can use my monitor on my computer to now mirror my phone so I can see what I'm doing. I got better lighting. Well, it's the same lights I was using, they're just in a better spot so it looks a little bit nicer. I've got my script and my laptop here if I need to look at things. We got the natural light coming in from this window. And I don't know, people say that corners give you a little bit more depth, but I felt like I kind of had that already just with coming forward from my desks anyway. So yeah, I'm just going to play with this for a little bit and see, and hopefully it looks a little bit better for you guys, and I think it's going to be much easier for me going forward, so I'm really looking forward to doing it. If you guys are new to the channel, make sure to check out my other videos. If you like what you see, hit a like and subscribe. And today I'm just going to talk about Gamsat Section 3. Gamsat Section 3 is probably a hard one for me to give advice on. I find that it's one of my weaker areas when actually sitting the Gamsat. However, I've sat it twice, I've done a little bit of prep for it and stuff. I think I've got a couple tips and a little bit of advice and just some strategies or some things that you can do leading up to it, which might just make sitting it a little bit easier. So I thought I'd just share that with you guys and hopefully you pick something out of it, and if not, well, better luck next video. Alright guys, let's get into it. So yeah, as I said, Section 3 is a bit of a tricky one really, because everywhere you look online, everywhere shows to always learn all of your fundamental chemistry and your physics and really get a good foundational knowledge of those really basic concepts. However, both times I sat at the Gamsat, I found that I very rarely needed to actually use those concepts at all. Like, throughout the whole thing, ACER were just either presenting new things that didn't really relate to a specific conceptual question. Like, I had no questions on like Gibbs free energy, I had no questions on like stereoisomers or like motion and vectors and any of those concepts or any of those theories really. It was all things that ACER had just predetermined and made up on the spot and wanted me to kind of derive a conclusion from. So hey, that's my understanding. Big possibility I probably didn't understand the questions at all, and in fact all of that conceptual stuff went completely over my head, and that's why I haven't actually recognized the concept and actually done well in the questions, which honestly was a bit disappointing because I studied really hard on my chemistry and my physics. So when I came out to the test, I was stoked. I wanted some Gibbs free energy, I wanted some organic chem and some reaction sequence to derive and follow a compound through. Like, I was ready for that stuff, I was pumped for it. And either I just didn't understand it or I was just unlucky in both my sittings. But yeah, I've never actually had to apply any of that stuff. So I think what I'm trying to say is that although learning those concepts and those topics are useful, I don't think learning the absolute intricacies of them are necessary to actually perform on the day. Because I believe it's really that foundational knowledge and that foundation that you build that's actually going to instill you with the scientific and the logical reasoning skills to be able to derive conclusions and come to the correct answer when you sit the test. So another point I want to mention as well are practice exams. So ACER give you the practice exams. I think there's like 4 or 5 of them at the moment, and they're a great tool to actually use to build that foundational knowledge up, because those practice exams really test you in your ability to reason and derive using those specific chemistry or physics principles that you already know leading up to it, or that you've studied, or that the test assumes that you have a prior knowledge and understanding of. In saying that though, the practice tests are completely different to the actual test on the day. They are, in my total experience, they are not similar whatsoever. The types of questions that you get on the practice exams are really concept specific, so it will be very obvious that you are dealing with Gibbs free energy, and it will give you an equation and it'll give you answers, and you have to derive what negative G is or something, and it's very obvious that they will give you a motion or a forces question, and it'll have all these newtons, and it'll be like what's the inelastic collision, or what's the the force of this rock as it moves through here, what are the forces opposing it, and you have to work it out from like a diagram they give you. There aren't questions that specific in the Gamsat when you actually sit it. The questions more use kind of those principles associated with it, but it's not as cut and dry as work out the force. It's more about trying to derive a logical explanation for something, like a scenario or something that they have described in the question. So it's a little different, and it tests you on a little bit different skills, or well, a couple different skills more rather, I should say. However, having knowledge of just the basic idea of how forces work will give you a little bit of an edge in those questions, but understanding the absolute intricacies of every concept and every principle, I believe, and again, completely based on my experience, is not actually going to give you a great benefit leading up to the test and allow you to do better than somebody who either only knows it very minorly or doesn't actually even know it at all. Another point I want to touch on is the purchasing of materials from these Gamsat prep companies and enrolling in courses that are like Gamsat prep courses. It's totally up to you if you want to pay for their services and ask for their help and make use of them, because that's great. Because lots of people use those resources. However, lots of people also succeed in the Gamsat without touching them at all. In my opinion, I'm not a big fan of them. I'm a big believer of actually understanding concepts and studying myself and doing my own individual learning to try and come up with reasonings and ways to find an answer and understand a concept. And I'm also not a big fan of how a lot of them employ fear-mongering and kind of fear tactics to kind of succumb you into buying their materials so that you don't feel as though you're not giving yourself the best opportunity, or so that you're not letting your family and friends down, because that's just ridiculous. You do see it everywhere though. So many people who do well in the Gamsat and get into medicine have also purchased these prep materials. However, I think so many people purchase these materials on their first time sitting of the Gamsat because they don't want to have to sit it a second time, that it then kind of oversaturates the market of people who have bought the prep material and then gone and sat the Gamsat and done well, when unknowingly they probably already had the inherent skills to do that well or marginally as good without having used the prep material at all. So then you start developing all this anecdotal evidence of all these people who say, oh, I got this score, I did really, really well, and I did this prep material, and I've only sat the Gamsat once, when if they had have sat the Gamsat once without that prep material, they may have done just as well anyway. So to me, that kind of brings up the question of, well, is there actually a causal relationship between these prep materials and doing well on the test? Or is there simply just some sort of an association between people who already have an inherently high enough skill to do well on the test, who have also just so happened along the way to have bought prep materials? So I'm not advocating to not buy prep materials at all. If it's something that you want to do, go for it, and you think it'll give you a better chance at performing well, then absolutely, if you're happy to pay the money, go nuts. However, I'm just kind of giving you guys my 2 cents essentially of why I haven't used them and why I don't like them, to maybe give you guys a little bit more insight and a bit more clarity into whether you actually want to make that informed decision or not. Now, some study that I do actually think is incredibly high yield, and every person sitting the Gamsat should actually prepare and study and learn this material, is maths. I believe every single person before sitting the Gamsat should have a pretty decent mathematical knowledge before attempting to sit it. Almost all of the questions in the Gamsat will either be something that you can derive using a mathematical equation or mathematical logic, and graphical interpretation. So yeah, I'll add one on top of that. Graphical interpretation and math knowledge are probably the 2 key and the 2 biggest principles that you need to learn and understand to be able to perform well when you sit the Gamsat. Almost all of the biology questions are actually just a biological concept graphed, and then you having to interpret the data from the graph. Both of my sittings, about probably 50% of my section 3 was graphical interpretation, and maybe even the one I sat just in March this year had even more graphical interpretation than that. If you're not that great at your graphical interpretation, probably some of the best resources you can do is just go on YouTube. There are so many people that break down like time versus distance graphs, like velocity versus time, velocity versus distance. All of those physics graphs really help to kind of cement this understanding of how to interpret lines and dots on 2 axes, along with the actual Gamsat practice tests. And they're great because they will actually test you in a very similar way that you will get tested to when you sit the real thing. And out of the practice tests, I think that the graphs that they ask you to interpret are actually the most realistic and appropriate representations of what you will see on the real thing. Now back to our math knowledge. Probably some of the biggest principles of maths that you need to understand is dimensional analysis, log rules, scientific notation, and then your SI units for different measurements. Your SI units are important because ACE will either give you a question which is either not in SI units, but then the answers will be, or vice versa. So it's really important to be able to recognize what a measurement is and what the SI units are, or if it is in its SI units, then what its actual measurements are, because they do like to trick you up and kind of flip things around to make it a little interesting. We've then probably got our three biggest math principles that are the most imperative to learn, which is scientific notation, log rules, and then dimensional analysis. These are the three concepts that you will get tested on the most heavily throughout the test. Now, considering that it is a scientific examination, you will be tested on big numbers and really, really small numbers as well. So it makes sense that they're going to use that scientific notation to denote these. What they will then go on to test you on as well is how these interact. So they'll ask you to, figure out a formula and find an answer based on these scientific notated numbers, and they're really big and really small. So you have to kind of understand how they all interact and how the subscripts interact with the real numbers to kind of come to a correct answer. Log rules, again, they love to use logs. They put logarithmic scales and logarithmic equations in there all the time. It's really important to understand how logarithmic scales work and how to interpret like a logarithmic graph, or being able to use log in an equation. Again, resources for that, you'll just have to hop online and just Google it. There are tons of free stuff on YouTube and everywhere, and they're really, really high yield, really, really, really useful. And then lucky last, dimensional analysis, which is just changing the units of your measurements. Now, that seems pretty straightforward for a lot of people, and I now have got a pretty good understanding of it, but for a lot of people it might be a little bit tricky, or they may not fully grasp and understand it. So it's a really good, just kind of go over that little foundational dimensional analysis as well. And again, there are heaps of exercises and heaps of YouTube videos out there which actually go through this and describe it and make it really easy to grasp and understand. When you're in that stage of needing to learn new math topics or chemistry or physics, something that isn't spoken about much is that if you've got a friend who's really proficient in it, just go talk to them. Go talk to friends, go talk to family members who know this stuff, and get them to teach you and help tutor you as well, because that is so invaluable, and it's a free resource, and you can just sit there and actually work at it at your own pace, and they'll be so much more patient and willing to listen, and you can ask specific questions that you may not get just off a random YouTube video. And that's exactly what I did. Leading up to the Gamsat in September last year, in 2020, I knew absolutely nothing about maths. I was absolutely awful at it, just atrocious. I could not understand any kind of fundamental math concept whatsoever. However, I do have one mate who is essentially doing a math degree at uni at the time. So I just messaged him, I was like, hey man, sitting the Gamsat, I don't know anything about maths. Can you help me with log rules? Can you help me with dimensional analysis? Can you help me rearrange equations? Like, I didn't even know simple basic algebraic rules. Another important thing, learn your algebra. And he just sat me down. We did it over Discord on the computer. He came over to my house a couple of times and we just smashed all this stuff out, and he taught me so much, and he got me to the point where it was like, oh my God, all of these holes in my math knowledge had just been filled in piece by piece by piece by piece. And I was now at a point where I could go and self-learn and learn these other intricate rules that I thought would have been necessary and helpful to me, like, furthering my understanding of log rules and understanding how scientific notation works in equations and things like that. And if it wasn't for him, I would have seriously struggled to build that base core layer to actually get to the point where I felt proficient and confident to be able to perform really, really well when I went and actually sat the Gamsat. So yeah, big props to friends. If you've got someone who knows these topics or a family member, use them. Really, really helpful. Cannot stress that enough. What I also do understand is that I understand this whole studying process can be incredibly grueling, quite draining, and sometimes even a little boring. And it can just feel as though you're not actually making any progress, and you're not developing your skills, and you're not actually seeing the results or even aware of the results that you're making. So a good way to kind of combat that and realize that you are actually improving and you're moving step by step closer to where you want to be is to answer some questions and then go back, study for like a week or two, revise, learn on these concepts, and then after a little bit, go back to that question. And I've mentioned this in a previous video as well, but go back to those questions and then don't look at the answer, just read the question again and actually try and tackle it again, and then see if you can actually find the answer, or at least understand where the answer came from if you already remember it from when you first said it. And it'll probably instill you with a little bit more confidence, a little bit more drive, and a bit more motivation that, hey, what I'm doing here is actually improving myself, and I'm actually feeling, I'm actually feeling pretty good about myself, and I'm keen to, put some more effort in and keep going and keep moving forward, so that when I do this again in 2 or 3 weeks time, I can see a little bit more growth. And it's awesome. It's a great feeling. It helps to make it feel a little bit less like Sisyphus being condemned by Zeus to try and push a boulder up a hill eternally for the rest of his life. So there we have it. That's essentially some of my advice and a little bit of my tips and tricks that I would give to you kind of going into the Gamsat for Section 3. Again, Section 3 isn't my best topic. It's not my most proficient section at all. I'm not that great at it. However, I hope that through listening, if you made it this far, you've at least picked up something and you've got a little bit more clarity, a little bit more idea in your head on how you want to tackle your studying leading up to the test. So if you enjoyed the video and you want to see more like this, make sure to hit that like and subscribe down the bottom because I really appreciate it. And if you want, leave a comment down below as well, detailing some of your Section 3 study tips so that hopefully other people, if they stumble across it, can see them and learn from that as well. All right, thanks guys. Until next time, see ya.